Ave Maria Stella, Dei Mater Alma.
Hello, and welcome back to Vatican II in a Year. This is your host, Father Matthew Schneider. I'm a priest of the Legionaries of Christ, and I teach theology. This is a podcast on the Star Christ Production Network at sqpn.com. Today we're on day 21. We're covering Sancto Sacramentals on the liturgy. We're going to start chapter 3 on the sacraments and sacramentals. Well, the other sacraments and sacramentals. We covered the Eucharist in chapter 2. And this first part is going to be on the role and the renewal of the sacraments and sacramentals. If you want to follow along, we have a reading plan and more details at sqpn.com/Vatican and frmatthewlc.com/Vatican. So yesterday we talked about the unity of the parts of Mass and we talked about concelebration. Today we're going to talk about the purpose of the sacraments in 59, and then 60-61 is really going to be on the sacramentals. The sacramentals are a little different from the sacraments in that they were not instituted by Christ, but instituted by the Church. They're still important. In the Catholic Church, we have three main types of sacramentals, which talk about blessings. You can bless a car, work tools, you can bless rosary, you can bless a person, etc. A lot of times people will also extend this to a blessed rosary or statue or something like that, or medal as a sacramental in itself. That's an appropriate way to extend that term. And then the consecrations. For example, I made religious vows. Those are a sacramental, not a sacrament. And then exorcisms, which, every diocese has its exorcist. That is not a ministry I desire to partake in. Just don't want to be dealing with the devil that closely. Anyway, so I trust other priests to do it, and I'm not jealous at all. I really don't want to do that. So interestingly, all three paragraphs today are quoted in the Catechism, at least a significant part of them. So paragraph 59 is on the purpose of the sacraments. It's quoted in the Catechism 1123. So let's read it. The purpose of the sacraments is to sanctify men, to develop the church, and finally to give worship to God, because they are signs that also instruct. That only presuppose faith, but by words and objects, they also nourish, strengthen, and express it. That is why they are called sacraments of faith. They do indeed impart grace, but in addition, the very act of celebrating them most effectively disposes the faithful to receive this grace in a fruitful manner, to worship God duly, and to practice charity. It is therefore of the highest importance that the faithful should easily understand the sacramental signs and should frequent with great eagerness those sacraments which were instituted to nourish the Christian life. So before we get into this, I think it's good to quickly read a definition of the sacraments. I got it from the Catechism 1131. The sacraments are efficacious signs of grace instituted by Christ and trusted to the Church, by which divine grace is disposed to us. So they're efficacious signs of grace. They work what we call ex opere operato on their own. They're efficacious. Even if the priest is a grave sinner, he's celebrating the Eucharist, it's valid. And they're signs of grace. They have some kind of physical manifestation signing to the invisible grace. They're instituted by Christ. Christ instituted all seven sacraments, and they're entrusted to the Church. He gave them to the Church, and by them, divine life is dispensed to us, right? We get the divine life in us. The first sentence here talks about three purposes of the sacraments, right? Sanctify the receiver, right? I get absolution. I am sanctified, right? My sister gets married. She is sanctified by that, right? And that's the first purpose, right? The sanctification of the one receiving the sacrament. Now, we need to continue on. What's the next one? Building the church, right? So every time I go to confession, I build up the church. Every time I celebrate the Eucharist, I build up the church, right? And then finally, glorifying God, right? These are the means that God gave us to glorify him, so it makes sense. And it has kind of this circular relationship with faith because it presupposes faith, but it strengthens us. It's kind of like a spiral staircase up towards heaven, right? In that sense, that you have faith and then you have a sacrament and that strengthens. You have more faith, you have another sacrament, and it keeps strengthening all the way up in this spiral, all the way up to heaven. And then they impart grace, right? That efficacious impartation of grace. And they dispose the faithful in that party of grace. Because in the sacraments, there is an efficacious sign. It's automatic, ex opere operato, which means by the very act of it doing it itself, right? So the priest, if I'm a priest, I'm validly ordained, I say the words of consecration and intended you in some vague way of consecrating the Eucharist, it is consecrated. Even if I'm a sinner, even if I'm doing it so that I could then give it to people to say a satanic mass or something crazy, it's valid, right? But there is a degree of fruitfulness in how you receive it, right? So if you know how sometimes certain masses you feel much more fervent, right? You're more disposed, right? If you're on a retreat and you're praying all weekend, and then the Sunday mass, you go to Sunday mass at the end of the retreat, And because you're been focused on Jesus so much that weekend, you're often more fervent, more disposed. That reception of the Eucharist is more fruitful in your life, right? So this fruitfulness depends on our understanding. And right, this goes back to active participation, understanding the sacraments, right? Because if I understand what's going on, if I participate in what's going on, I'm going to be more properly disposed. So this is why they're pedagogical. This is a theme we keep repeating, right? And this will lead us to eagerly receive them. If I understand the beauty of the Eucharist, the beauty of the sacrament of confession, I'm going to keep going. I'm going to keep receiving. I'm not just going to be like, maybe I'll go, maybe Easter and Christmas. No, I'm going to go every Sunday or every day. So we need to move on to paragraph 60. It's really going to define the sacramentals. It's quoted in Catechism 1667 for that definition, right? So we're going to read the text. Holy Mother Church has, moreover, instituted sacramentals. These are sacred signs which bear a resemblance to the sacraments. They signify effects, particularly of a spiritual kind, which were obtained through the Church's intercession. By them, men are disposed to receive the chief effect of the sacraments, and various occasions in life are rendered holy. So, right, that's the definition. It's a good definition. They resemble the sacraments, right? They help dispose for the sacraments. They're often, in a liturgical setting, right? So, like, you might have a Sunday where you get a, after Mass, the priest will bless your pets, or when I did my religious vows, it was right at the same time you do a wedding vows if you were doing that in Mass, right after the homily, right? That's when I did my religious vows. I made vows 3 times. I made first vows, renewed once, and then did final vows. So I was in temporary vows. The first and the renewal were each 3 years. So I was in temporary vows for 6 years, right? So those type of things, right, are there, and they're also connected with that sacrament, right? It disposes me for those sacraments, right? Obviously, in a male religious community where my community says everyone's going to be a priest, it obviously is part of the preparation for the priesthood, but it is vows in itself. And even in another community, let's say Franciscans, where a lot of them maintain brothers forever, permanent brothers, that would dispose me for the sacraments still, even if I'm only going to receive them. I'm not going to be the minister in the sense of like a priest or deacon. And they're instituted by Christ, not the Church. That's why we look for her intercession. And we don't just look for her intercession on earth, right? We have the Church on earth, the Church in heaven, the Church in purgatory, for all that. And hopefully the sacramentals are those helps to really help us with divine grace, which we get in these sacraments. So moving on to paragraph 61. This is talking about how the sacraments and the sacramentals both sanctify us. It's quoted in the section on sacramentals in the Catechism 1670. So let's read it. Thus, for well-disposed members of the faithful, the liturgy of the sacraments and sacramentals sanctifies almost every event in their lives. They are given access to a stream of divine grace which flows from the paschal mystery of the passion, death, and resurrection of Christ, the font from which all sacraments and sacramentals draw their power. There's hardly any proper use of material things which cannot be directed towards the sanctification of men in the praise of God. So that's the text. I think it's really that all of us is that sanctification for God, right? So it's sanctifying each moment, right? We have 1 Thessalonians 5. St. Paul says, rejoice, always pray constantly, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you, right? St. Paul is saying, pray always. So how can you pray always, right? You have to go to work. You have to, type in your computer. You have to do this or that, right? But the thing is, in these sacramentals, they have things that can bless every aspect of life. There's a whole bunch of different ones for blessing different types of work tools, from fishing nets to winemaking equipment to industrial tools, right? And so that sanctifies that moment, right? It sanctifies the use of that. And they have the vows, right? Religious vows. I made my religious vows, and through that, every moment in obedience is sanctified, right? So my superiors told me, just, work on certain projects I have, and they've approved me to write this. And so they're like, hey, they aren't here like dictating what I do every minute, but with the blessing of obedience, I am sanctifying each moment. And the same thing for a faithful marriage, right? The husband and wife who work together, who strive to have a faithful marriage, have the same thing, in their marriage. Obviously that's a sacrament, whereas the vows are only a sacramental, but the same idea. And I think this idea of blessing everything, I think it's something that we Americans get back more in. I know when I was a kid, the Filipinos in my parish, I went to a parish with a lot of Filipino immigrants at it. They would almost always, when they got a new car, they would bring it up to Father after Mass and have him bless it, right? And that is something where you're trying to sanctify even, driving down the road. And finally, it notes us how it's that stream of divine grace which flows from Paschal mystery, the passion, death, and resurrection of Christ, right? So in our lives, you can relive those moments of passion, death, and resurrection. We can be with Jesus in that. So hopefully this is helpful. Hopefully it really helps you to live these sacraments and the sacramentals, not just the sacraments, the 7 sacraments, and forget all about the sacramentals because they are valuable too in our lives. Thank you for listening to this episode of Vatican II in a Year. This is a listener-supported podcast. You can donate to help StarQuest produce it. Another great podcast at sqpn.com/give. You can give one time, monthly, or join the StarQuest Patreon. Tomorrow, we're going to continue with the next paragraphs in this document on the liturgy, Sacrosanctum Concilium, paragraphs 62 to 68 on adult catechumens, the vernacular language, English for us, and slight changes to the rite of baptism. Please join us then to learn more about Vatican II, which provide a blueprint for the Catholic Church. If you want more information, such as reading plans or individual document playlists, go to sqpn.com/Vatican, frmatthewlc.com/Vatican, or Vatican SQPN on Facebook or X for more information.
Amen.